Welcome to the Money Insights Podcast, where high-income earners come to learn wealth-building strategies that will take them from high income to high net worth. With your hosts, financial and wealth-building experts, Christian Allen and Rod Zabriskie.
Welcome into today's episode of the Money Insights Podcast. I'm your host, Christian Allen. With me, as always, Rodney the Pod Zabriskie. Rod, what's up, man?
Hey, I am doing great. And I love this time of year.
Why? What's so great about this time of year, Rod?
Well, you're going to think it's because of the holidays. And I'm not saying I don't like
because it's college football.
That's it. That's it.
Okay.
I keep coming back. You just
love this time. You love the college football vibe, man. I can't blame you. There is something more fun about it, although it feels a little bit like professional sports now.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
You think about, okay, so anyone listening to this knows that, like, I grew up a BYU fan. Rod went to BYU.
Mm-hmm.
But this was shocking, and we're going to move off of this quick, I promise. But this was shocking. BYU, of all teams, is like willing to put out $4.5 million on an NIL deal for what's that? The Abanza kid, who's supposed to be the first pick in the 2026 draft. It's insane.
Yeah.
It just like feels like a whole different world. That feels like something that you get, like, you know, I guess I was going to say like your Ohio States, but that's football. So going over, that feels like your Dukes and your Kansas and your Kentuckys. Well, apparently the big BYU, they're going all in on it. So anyway, excited about that. It's kind of fun.
It is wild.
Okay. But that's basketball. Football, obviously we have like a magic season going on. I hope I don't jinx us for tomorrow, Rod, because we got 3 games left, and I got to tell you, like, BYU, like, we've won every one of them, but I'm still scared every single game.
Yeah,
so this isn't like we're just like running through everybody like gangbusters. Like, there's some tight games in there, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So fingers crossed. We don't want to have Iowa State's fate. Okay,
that's
Rod.
Right.
Maybe we need to start a college football podcast.
Yeah.
We need to do.
Yeah, that'd be nice.
And everybody listening is like, okay, guys, enough of college football. Come on. Okay. Well, we're going to get out of college football and we're going to talk about money. And we're specifically going to talk about like the impact of the national debt and the rising national deficit. I mean, both of them are rising, but we're going to get into some of the things that we should be like aware of, and like, again, the overall impact of this insane national debt and equally as insane federal budget deficit.
Yeah.
Does that sound fun or what? And we're going to try to do it without depressing everybody.
Okay.
I don't know if it's possible. I feel like we should have started, Rod, by like, man, if we could go back, we might have to redo this and put something up on the screen that's like that ticker. The ticker that shows like the active, how much the money's going up, like the deficit's going up like every second. And it's just like goes up by millions. You're just like, it's unbelievable.
It is.
It's to the point where it just feels like monopoly money to most of us. Mm-hmm. But what we're going to do today is we're going to try to figure out, okay, how does that game of monopoly that's happening out there actually impact, or how could it impact? Does it impact our lives, and could it impact our lives? Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Okay. So before we get going, as always, Rod, I like you to create the foundational elements that we need to have a meaningful conversation around this. What is the federal budget deficit? What is the national debt? And when I say what it is, not what's the number, although we want to get into that.
Yeah.
What is it as a whole? And then tell us what the actual number is. Because most people know, but although I'll say this, they didn't know. I didn't know the number. So they know what it is typically, but man, the number just like jumps out at you and surprises every time. Okay, get us going.
Yeah. So let's start with the deficit, because that happens on an annual basis. The federal government makes a budget and they're going to spend money, but they don't know how much they're going to bring in. Actually, they have a pretty good idea. They know they're overspending. There's no question.
Yeah.
And what's I don't know if it's amusing because it's so kind of like depressing at the same time, is they'll often talk about, we're reducing the deficit. And it makes you think that
there's like real progress happening.
Actual debt, but no, they're just reducing the amount. No. They think they're reducing the amount that they're going to go in the hole further this year.
That singular year.
Yeah.
So Rod, I'm letting the cat out of the bag. Instead of 1.8 trillion a year, that's our deficit, by the way.
Yeah.
It's funny because I looked at that and I was like, I obviously I knew that the debt, national debt, was in the trillions, but I was like, 1.8 trillion. I was like, oh, that's not as bad as I remembered. And then I was like, oh, that's the yearly deficit.
Singular year, yeah.
Yikes. So yeah, that's a problem. And it's still a problem even if I reduce it from 1.8 trillion to 1.3 trillion.
Right.
It's still a massive amount that's just adding on.
Which is wild because you think, man, $500 billion, that's a huge number, right? That's a number, like you said, monopoly money. I just can't even fathom that number.
Yep.
And that would feel like, oh man, that's a huge bonus. Like if you could reduce the deficit by that much, and then you're like, oh,
yeah, it's still it's
1.3.
It's a baby step.
That's still a really big number. So.
Yeah. Baby steps, Rod. I guess baby steps. Although I don't know that we took baby steps to get into the kind of debt that we're in. So maybe we need something more drastic to get out of it. Okay. So you talked about the federal deficit. And then, of course, the national debt is just, what the country, it's just the number of dollars the country's in debt. And that number sits at a cool, how much is it, Rod?
35.9. As of this recording, it will go up by the time we release.
By the time we're done, it'll be probably over 36 trillion when you see this. So that is just, again, unfathomable. Like I say, it feels like as long as I can remember, this whole conversation around national debt is just dealing with like monopoly money. It's fake. I'm like, I don't know how. I have no idea how this ends up getting resolved, but. Rod, we're going to talk about at least, some of the things that we need to be thinking about. And maybe we'll talk about some of the stuff that we can do to at least make sure that we on an individual level are prepared for the impact of what this kind of means. And of course, we have a different presidency. We'll see what happens as far as the national debt goes. When's the last time it was reduced? Do we even know? I mean, I know they say Obama blew it up. And I know, like, he was there. Like, again, I don't look at it like that linear. Like it's kind of silly to be like, this president did this or this president did that. I mean, to some extent it can be valuable, but to a large extent, it's my favorite saying, the situation is the boss. And like, regardless of who was in office when COVID-19 hit, well, that was going to happen. It was just a reality.
It straddled both of them. Yeah, for sure.
Yep. So anyway,
I'm going to share my screen here. And so anyone who's viewing this on YouTube, you'll be able to see kind of the trajectory. So getting back to your question, when's the last time it went down? Well, it's kind of hard to tell exactly, but it looks like it may have gone down a little bit in the 50s.
So 70 years ago, it might have had a slight bump.
It might have gone down a little bit.
Okay, but it is crazy to think about, Rod, because I don't think I realized. So I'm born right here, 1983. I'm using that so no one can see that, but 1983. So my entire life, it has been in the trillions and just accelerating. And of course, as we look at the pace now, it just accelerates at this crazy, nasty pace.
Yeah. So the last president to kind of make an impact was Clinton. So if you look at what's happening there in the 90s, it basically flattened out for several years. So what that means is that there was not a deficit. Right? They were still accruing interest on it. I think they might have even had some positive budget years there. We were actually taking in more revenue than they were spending. But then again, the interest. So that's why I say I don't think it went down in the 90s, but that was the kind of the last time it was somewhat in check. Let's just say. So
Rod, what do you think of the billionaire tax cuts? I know we're not getting into this, but I'm just curious. Like, is that going to be like? I know that was a big run. Like, hey, if we get the billionaire tax cuts in place, like that could help us a little. Does that kind of stuff have what do you think? Would that have an impact?
Good question. So there are several things going on right now, right? There's this Department of Government Efficiency that Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy are going to take on, and they say that they're going to find $2 trillion of duplication, waste, different things that they can just remove. And wouldn't that be amazing? And all of a sudden the deficit's gone. Yeah.
Man, that would be amazing. Okay, so if you actually started reducing not just the deficit, but the actual debt, now like you feel like you're actually doing something.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. No, but that's not the question you asked. As far as tax cuts go, there's this trail, and if you follow the trail, what economists tell you anyway. I'm not an economist, but I just play one on YouTube sometimes.
You're putting an economist hat on.
Yeah, but they say that the long-term effects, to a certain point, you reduce taxes that allows people to put more money into the economy, into their businesses, into building things, building GDP. And so the long-term effect is that you actually take in more revenue by cutting tax rates. And again, so there are economists out there who will point to times where, like, for example, the Trump tax cuts, they point to it and they say, hey, look, tax revenue went up even though the rates were lower, especially for these higher income people and corporations and things like that. So that's the word out there.
You'd never answered how you felt about the billionaire tax cuts. I'm trying to hold you down.
So that's what I was trying to do right there. Maybe I wasn't
okay.
There. But
say it again. Maybe I was just like sleeping for a second.
No worries. By cutting taxes, you actually raise revenues, because then those billionaires are going out there and putting more money into their businesses, research and development.
Okay, I see. So you're saying no tax cuts. We're going to focus on growth of the economy as the focal point. And you're saying, of course, and this is the typical conservative versus or Republican
liberal,
Democrat kind of fight. Is do we do it through like taking it from people, or do we do it by stimulating the economy? And of course, as capitalists, we tend to lean toward this side where we're like, hey, let's go, let's focus on building the economy so that we can accomplish this rather than just taking from people. Now, I will say this though, Rod, as when I think about just so there's the empathetic side of me comes in at times, and I think like, okay, it is pretty crappy though that like, your average individual person making $80,000 a year is paying 20% in tax, and a billionaire is paying like 5%. Maybe it's not that, but maybe it is, right? Mm-hmm. Like I'm sure many billionaires don't pay, like have figured out how to reduce taxes completely with a lot of sophisticated ways and ideas to do that. And so when I hear that, I'm kind of like, that feels a little icky to me. So I'm kind of in this weird place where I 100% am a capitalist, but I also feel like, would it really hurt to like create a minimum standard where it's like, okay, you can use tax, you can use all these fancy schmancy ways of cutting taxes in your personal world up to like a certain extent. So that's where my head goes. Like maybe we like make it a minimum of 10% or something like that. That way it's at least somewhat proportionate to, now again, those are typically the people who are creating jobs. And so like, you don't want to like hurt them, right? So I'm also not in the camp where it's like, hey, let's go and make them pay 50% and make it hard to start businesses and make it hard to pay employees. Like that's not a winning formula in my mind. But anyway, just an interesting one. And part of the reason I asked it was because one of the posts I put up a few weeks ago on social media was about the billionaire tax cuts, and it was one of them that had a little bit more interest and intrigue, and so I thought I'd get your opinion.
Yeah.
Okay, Rod, you are a true capitalist, it sounds like.
I am. I'm not quite libertarian, but I'm probably closer to libertarian than I am Republican. How's that?
Okay, that's fair. Okay, so we know what the budget, the deficit is. We know what the actual numbers around them are. They're insane. Why in the world does this stuff even matter? Because can I be honest with you, Rod? In my life, and I'm like in the financial space, it doesn't feel like it's had any impact on my life. Now, I'm sure it has. It has, but we're talking about that.
It's a great point because I removed the chart, but when you look back at it and you say, well, in 2000 we were at 5 trillion. In 2010 we were at 14 trillion. By 2020 we were at 25. And so, but to your point, does it feel like your life was all that different between 2020 to 2000 to 2010 to 2020? And I mean, in reality, we've grown a business in that time. We've done some really cool things. So the question is, does it matter? And there are a lot of people who say it doesn't. We'll get into that here in a little bit, that the debt per se isn't, because we get to define that, right? Like when I say we, Congress says, well, what's our debt limit? What's the ceiling? Well,
Right.
we want it to be,
We want
this
more.
now. We want it to be this now. And they just keep adjusting it. And
it's insane.
Yeah.
It's insane. But I will say this, just a quick thought. When I like the human side of me looks at this, and it just makes you like have very little confidence in the country's ability to manage money, right? Because you think about it on an individual level, if you got like, I don't know what the individual, like what this looks like in an individual situation. Like how does that translate? 36 million as a country, or 36 trillion as a country. It's still got to be a large amount of debt as a person, right?
Yeah.
So
okay.
I think about that. Oh, go ahead.
That's a great point, because when you look at the GDP, so the gross domestic product, that's how much money changes hands in transactions, in the United States in a year. Well, guess what that was for 2023? 27 trillion.
Okay.
So we are, if we're now 8 trillion above that, well, that's 25%. So that's basically 125% of whatever someone makes, right?
Is going to.
If they're in debt by that, and it's continually growing, is that a healthy place to be?
Right. And we all look at that and say, like, okay, we don't run our individual financial lives that way. And if you do, you end up bankrupt.
Yeah.
And struggling financially. And so like the question, of course, then begs, what does it mean for a power country? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's interesting.
And it goes even beyond that, because what if you were at 125% and you've already made contracts to get further to spend a whole bunch of money in the future, again, not knowing what your revenue is going to be in the future. And that's Social Security. Right. That's Medicare. That's some of these things where that money's promised out, but they spent it.
Yeah. It's not there anymore. So where is it coming from?
Support that. And ironically, there are companies out there, people who are in prison for spending the pension money. And yet Congress
what a mess. What a mess.
Keeps going.
They just keep going. Okay. All right, Rod, let's talk about why. Okay, so we talked a little bit about why the federal budget deficit matters. Let's get into some of the causes of the rising deficit. So some of them are pretty obvious, right? Like when we need economic stimulus, we have massive increases in the debt. And of course, COVID was a huge one. 2008, when they're bailing out, big companies, those were like the two that come to mind as probably the biggest stimulus situations that of our lifetime. Yeah. What else are we missing, Rod? Talk about some other things that caused the deficit.
Well, I mean, we have a huge budget, right? As a country, when you think about military and healthcare, and well, even just the interest that we're accumulating on the debt, the 35 trillion turns into.
Yeah, it's not,
because as we were tracking a little bit, when I looked at in July of this year, it's 35.5. Now it's 35.9. Again, wild to think that it just in a few months it's gone up like that. So that's the interest. But then, I mean, just all the money we spend. Like, think about FEMA. Think about all the money that is being, spent in these areas that were hit by these hurricanes recently, devastating them, and the government's coming in and helping them do that. Well, that's the only revenue the government has is somewhere. Yeah, exactly. So just all of those things.
Okay. All right. So I think the next step, Rod, is naturally our next step is to figure out or talk a little bit about what are the actual impacts of this national debt. So I'm going to list out a handful right here, and then we'll take a minute and just talk through. We won't go through every one of them in detail, but we'll go through a handful of these that we think are kind of important to touch on. Okay, so some of the consequences, obviously, the just overall rising debt burden that just continues to go out of control. Inflation, that's been a concern, and we've seen that recently.
Yep.
higher interest rates, potential crowding out of private investments. So if the government is issuing bond money, that leaves less money for private investors, and so again, just less opportunity for that reason. Obviously, slows economic growth. This is a big one: the burden on future generations, and that's the one that comes to my mind a lot of times because I'm thinking like, okay, like we're playing around with this stuff like it is Monopoly, but at some point, someone is going to have to pay the piper or actually figure out a way to pay the deficit or again, whatever the alternative to that is. And I've heard all sorts of theories about China and what that relationship could look like because it seems like we owe them a bunch of money. Anyway, there's just a lot of kind of wild things going on there. And then maybe the last couple to hit on is just the overall U.S. financial stability and our currency. So the United States, the dollar is the world currency, and of course, if they look at America as an unstable dollar, just unstable financially, then obviously that could change. So anyway, there's a bunch of potential consequences that come from it, and we're going to get into some of those. Rod, where do you want to start?
Well, let's start with inflation. I think that's been something we've lived through recently. And interestingly enough, to some people, it was a surprise. To other people, they've been calling on doom and gloom for a long time.
It's been expected, but it finally came. Yeah.
Yeah. And here's one of the things that I think happened. And this is me. Who knows, right? But this is according to Rod.
Okay, I like it.
2008, where there was a huge stimulus. I don't remember the exact number. Around 800 billion is the number that comes to mind, right? That was the stimulus. That was the money they were giving to the companies to shore them up, the too big to fail kind of thing and whatnot, right?
Yep. Yeah.
So
AIGs and
and all these banks and everything. So that money goes into the system. It increased the debt, right? They printed that money to go out there, sold the bonds, it goes out. And then everybody was just predicting all kinds of inflation coming from that. And the reason is, so here's the reason why. It's supply and demand. If you flood the system with more supply, then that's going to it changes prices, right? It means that the value of the dollars that were already there is less. And well, that's the definition of inflation, right?
Yeah.
So, but it didn't happen. We didn't see huge jumps in inflation.
That was the rhetoric that we constantly were hearing is like, okay, we're going to have to pay in inflation. Okay.
Yep.
That didn't happen to your point.
It didn't happen. So that led a lot of people to start saying, oh, well, that was nice. That felt pretty good. We could print all this money. We could increase the debt. And it didn't turn into this out of control inflation that everybody was worried about. So I think when by the time the 2020 came and COVID hit and everybody was staying home, not working, what's going to happen? Well, that they start printing these checks and sending them out to the country, and again, so that increased the supply. In that case, I don't remember the final number, 2.2 trillion or whatever it was that the stimulus was. But I think the big difference, the reason why it didn't have the impact back in 2008, like it did after the 2020, is because that money in 2008, it went into the companies, and I'm not going to say it just sat there, but it kind of like replaced money that evaporated in the previous 6 months, right? And so was it an increase in the supply, and did it get circulated through the economy? And the answer, I think, is generally no. And that's why it didn't cause the inflation. But when you're sending checks to families and they're going out and buying groceries with it and whatever, like they're spending that money, now that's out in the system. And what that does is it gets spent not just once, but many times, right? Yeah. They buy their groceries, the grocery, chain or whatever, they pay their employee, that employee goes and spends it. It's used to buy supplies. And anyway, so that inflation basically ultimately happened because of so many more dollars out there being used, again and again and again. And that's why we saw inflation this time, but didn't previously. But that's why it was more dangerous, is because there was this theory that it doesn't matter. Like, we can print as much as we want and it won't cause inflation.
Yeah, well, and that resonates. It seems like a good principled theory. You know what I mean? So it makes sense. But to your point, like, there is a big difference between giving money to big banks versus putting it right in the hands of people who are going to literally spend it, a week later.
Yeah.
And now it's out there in the economy and it's doing all the things that it's doing.
Yep.
Okay. So that's the big one. What about interest rates? So, obviously inflation and interest rates are directly correlated, but talk about kind of the connection between interest rates and the deficit.
Yeah, man, that was interesting, because I remember as we were seeing the inflation, and inflation leads to higher interest rates. So go back to when interest rates were their highest in the late 70s, early 80s. That's because inflation was really high in the 70s, and they had to raise interest rates to keep that into control, basically slow down the circulation of money, right? So, but what happened is, because of the debt, then the question was, well, how much can the Fed raise rates without just driving the debt infinitely higher, and just basically driving us into oblivion, versus keeping inflation in control? So then the question was, are we at a place where we actually ever can keep inflation in control by raising rates enough?
I have a question for you, Rod.
Okay.
Do you think the U.S. should use the shred method to reduce some of its debt, or would it be better off using the snowball method? Which one do you like better?
I would say both.
We need both. We need all
The nuclear option,
strategies that are available. We need all of them.
Yes.
We need all of them.
Yes.
Okay. Well, it just made me think about, like, when we talk about people in debt and like, okay, how do we get out of it? Well, there's like these theories on the best way to pay highest interest rate. I think that's the snowball version, but
yeah,
there's got to be something that's happening, right? And at least right now, it still feels like, it doesn't just feel like, it isn't happening, because we still see it going up, and it'll just be interesting to see how that plays out. Okay, so Rod, what are the effects on government programs? What does that element look like? Because obviously you talked about the connection between, spending and government, but just kind of talk about what the impact looks like.
Well, I have to think that anybody who thought that we can just keep printing money, keep driving the debt higher, working in a deficit, and it just would never really matter. Like, that number just becomes big, and it's like, kind of like you were saying, it's just a number.
Yeah.
Whether it's 5 or 20 or 50 or 500, it's just a number, and it doesn't matter. Well, I think we're finding that it does matter. And we talked earlier already about Social Security and Medicare. We have a lot of promised money out there. And in order to kind of bring the deficit into check, I think changes have to be made to existing programs like that. But then also, I think it just pushes you to have to be more careful in introducing new stuff, which can be problematic. Because I remember at the beginning of President Biden's time in office, where he talked about, we're going to do all this stuff with transportation, right? We have a lot of old transportation systems that need to be updated, and we're going to put a bunch of money into that. Yeah, and I don't think that happened certainly not the scale he's talking about.
Well, okay, so here's what I see here. This is one of the places that it's not theoretical anymore, because there have actually been changes to Social Security, right? Mm-hmm. So, for example, we see the age of Social Security inching upward.
Yeah.
Whereas I don't know where it's at now, 67, something like that, 67, 68. Like,
yeah.
But 10 years ago, that number was like 64, 65, maybe 65. I can't remember.
Yeah, probably more than 10 years ago, but you're right. It's been inching. It was 65. And then over the last, 20 years, it's little by little increased.
Yeah. Well, here's what I remember. I remember early on in my career when I was in the retirement income planning space, spending a lot of time there. I remember literally having some of those inching up moments happening.
Yep.
So yeah, maybe it has been more than 10 years, but that's also been something that people, so it's two things, right? It's reduction in the actual amount, and think about the impact of that. Like, that's a really difficult one, because this is oftentimes people who are at a place in their life where they can't continue to work. So it's not like they can just go get another, it's not as easy to just go get another job to make up for potential cuts that come from that. So it really is, like, to me, that shows a really personal impact of this stuff, where we typically just look at it and it's like pie in the sky numbers, we're just like, whatever. But for people in that situation, like, it very much has impacted and will continue to impact. And of course, for a lot of people, it might mean that Social Security doesn't exist at all in however long, you know? So anyway, but that's just one of them. And obviously the military and, all these different government sectors are directly impacted because now they can't innovate. They can't do new things. They're hamstrung inside of a budget, obviously.
Yeah.
I guess, unless, of course, all of them are just doing what they want anyway. So if that's the case, then, maybe, but at least as of right now, it feels like the government trying to like hold some constraints, but just not doing enough.
Yeah.
Or putting constraints on places, but not doing enough to actually make an impact or cut into the deficit, for example.
Yeah. And how long have we heard the cliff is coming? We need to make decisions. We need to make changes. And again, like to your point, there have been some changes made, but even after those changes, they're like, okay, the cliff's still there. So what are we going to do?
So they haven't been anywhere near significant enough. Again, looking at Social Security, inching up to 67 isn't anywhere near enough to actually cut into things. So there's a lot of work to do. Okay. That's government programs. Rod, talk about the impact on on us as investors and the financial markets in general.
Yeah. So, I mean, talk about bonds to begin with, right? So
we hit on bonds a little bit, but that's a good starting point.
Full faith and security of the U.S. government. I think
it doesn't feel that great when less.
Yeah. Now,
okay, so the good news is there's never been a default up to this point.
Yep.
So that's encouraging. But again, you're thinking okay, well, they're not defaulting by getting into more debt. So again, where does that quote unquote cliff come in? Are we up 50 trillion? That's the number. Is it 200 trillion? Where's the number where it's no more?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great point. So, but the point is that it's what determines pricing and other things like that. Well, it's the investors, right? If they're willing to buy those bonds, then great. The rates will reflect that. If people stop being comfortable buying those bonds, well, that changes the pricing completely. Like the demand makes a difference on that. And so now all of a sudden, the rates have to change solely because of that. Well, if that happens and you can no longer get buyers for the bonds, or you have to sell them at huge discounts to get that, then it makes it even less attractive or worse, I guess, for the debt as a whole. If you adjust accordingly and have to raise the rates or do whatever to attract those people back.
Right, imagine this, okay? Imagine if the U.S. government was a corporation and I was going to take a bond from that corporation. Would anybody feel good about that business?
No, if it was anything other than the federal government, absolutely no, they wouldn't, right?
So yeah, people are taking out these treasury bonds, and suddenly when you take a step back, it gets really hard to feel a lot of confidence, even though they haven't defaulted up to now. Again, just looking at it as like a person, or looking at it like a business, and you would run from it. You would never do it, right? You would just be like, I'm out completely. And yet people continue to do. I guess I can understand why, at least until some sort of defaults do happen, it still feels like a relatively like a safe place. And of course, if the government has the ability to keep printing money at, without any sort of regulation on that, then it seems like it probably still is safe. Okay, so that's going to get into some of our perspective. We're going to start talking a little bit about theory on managing the actual debt, unless there's anything else you want to talk about as it relates to kind of the investors in the financial markets.
Well, maybe we can now hit on real quickly just we talked about the global reserve currency and its ability to maintain that position, because the thought is if we ever lose that position, it is just like a stack of cards, right?
Yep.
Because
then it comes down, man. We can't have that.
Yep.
Okay. So here's the question, Rod. How the heck are we going? Now we're going to put on your economic solutions hat. You're an economist, but now you have all the answers. How are we going to get rid of this crazy problem? What do you think?
So number one is the annual deficit. We have to figure out how to not spend more than we take in.
Oh, that's brilliant, Rod. Man, like you're saying that there has to be some sort of an actual budget, like an actual
responsibility
and like accountability for it, all those types of things. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's a good starting point, because obviously if you don't do that, then you're never making any type of, you're never taking anything out of the massive national debt that's there.
Yeah.
So, and you think about that, like, it's even worse than that, man. This wasn't supposed to be depressing.
Yeah, we're trying we're trying to keep it.
Okay, this is fun and light. You're right. So you think about, and I don't know what the interest is on the 35.9 trillion, but like, are we even covering, like, even if we were to get out of that, like, there's just this massive mountain to climb. But okay, either way, to your point, you've got to start by having a positive federal budget every year. And obviously that gives you at least a chance to start making some, good news. Elon's on it, Rod. 2 trillion a year. We're cutting it right out. Man, they're going to wipe this debt out in no time. Rod, what's modern monetary theory and why is it relevant?
Okay, I kind of referenced this a little bit earlier. After the kind of 2008, it really caught wildfire, so to speak, because we didn't see the inflation after that. And basically it's that they say the deficits don't really matter. The deficits don't matter. The debt doesn't really matter. It's just a number. And so we don't have to worry about it. Just don't even think about it anymore. Let's just go about our business.
I like that.
And
that sounds great.
Not even worry about it.
I like it. Okay. What's the theory behind why it works to just not worry about it?
I mean, part of it was what I was referring to in the 2008 thing. Right.
Yeah, they just don't think.
Hey, we did it, and
really
we didn't have to worry about the
okay, so you're saying, hey, look, we've been down this road. We know it's going to be okay. Don't stress about it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds like a responsible theory.
Well, and I want you to tell us a little bit about our friend Richard Duncan, because I know you like some of the things.
I do like so Richard Duncan obviously has Market Watch that he puts out, and I'll go in and check in on it. But one of the things that he talked about, and I remember this was probably one that he did, a year or two ago even. But it resonated with me because the thought was, he's basically saying, instead of trying to climb that massive mountain that is the debt and just try to scrape out, he's actually saying, spend and innovate and build the economy and let that be what's doing. So he's actually saying, lean into it. Now, the goal obviously isn't to increase the debt. The goal long-term is to decrease the debt. Mm-hmm. But what he's suggesting is, instead of cutting everywhere, we spend, we innovate, we build the economy, and that is what creates more revenue, more opportunity, so that we can actually do. And he gave a comparison on, like, this was just another element, another point. He was saying China has been passing us in relationship to innovation and new technology. Mm-hmm. And that's a huge problem as well. So from a country standpoint, the idea is like, hey, we've just got to like really get back to our roots of becoming an innovative country. That's how we became what we are. Let's focus on that stuff. And if I'm being totally honest, when I look at the debt, like, the idea that Richard Duncan is speaking there resonates with me just because it feels like, impossible. And again, it also is one of those things where people have been trying to do it for, how long, with like very little success. So it almost makes you think, okay, if that's not working, we got to come up with some other plan. It might actually make sense to do that. And of course, if we can get the country to a place where the economics are so strong that it's cutting into it, it just makes everybody's life a lot easier, right? And anyway, I'm a positive person too, and so I kind of like that idea. It's like, okay, instead of taking that like negative route, like we've got to just try to pull everything back. We're just going to innovate like crazy and build this thing up, and that's going to be what drives it. For whatever reason, that just like that hits me as a good way to go. And yet I also realize, both sides of that equation. It's probably scary because we're like, well, what if it doesn't work? Right.
Yeah,
that's the concern with Richard. So what if I lean into it? We, over the next XY couple years, let's say, instead of having a deficit of 1.8, it's a deficit of 5 trillion. I don't know. I'm just throwing out numbers.
Sure.
But by doing that, we're able to innovate and create a better economy. Like, it could be worth it. But if you do it and you fail, then all of a sudden you're just, although to Richard's point, like you might just be in the same place at that point. Like it may not really be that much different. You know what I mean?
Speed up the timeline, but kind of high risk, high reward kind of.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic. So anyway, I can't remember. I feel like he had a specific name for the kind of philosophy around that. I don't remember what it is, but that's the basic philosophy. It's spend money, be capitalistic, innovate, create, build, be the country that the US has been historically, and that will give us an opportunity to like knock this thing out. I like it. I'm going with that one, Rod. Even though nobody else is, I'm going with it. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm going to take a little bit of a different angle on that, and it goes back to your question earlier about tax cuts, especially on corporations, on innovators, right? Because when you say historically, well, where did the innovation come from? Well, it was from private businesses, private individuals.
Yeah, so you're bringing it back to the individuals.
Yeah.
Okay, so when I say that, Rod, when I say spend, that's interesting. I guess I hadn't thought of it in those terms, but in my mind, I'm thinking of the same principle you're talking about here. Like, get it into the hands of the individuals who can. So like, we don't want the government being the ones managing the innovation. We want the money to get to the people on the streets who can innovate.
And I think that's what I've heard. That's the angle I think Richard's taking to it. I think he's saying grants from the government to
you're right,
industry to do that.
Yep, he has.
And I'm coming at it from the other direction of saying, if we reduce the burden on them of taxes, of regulation, just of all the, if you think about, again, like a company in California has, I don't remember the exact number I read, but of every dollar of their expenses, like 50% of somewhere between 40 and 50% of it has to do with taxes and regulation and just these.
And that's brutal. Like I totally agree. That's brutal for a capitalist who's trying to build a business and like stimulate the economy through growth. It's just hard to do.
Yeah. So
there's not a lot of money left. Well, I think about our business today. Like our business is like a high profit business. And in other words, like we don't have to carry a lot of debt in our business, right? There's not a lot of overhead. But I think about when we purchased and ran the spa for a few years, and man, it's like the taxes between all of those extra things, the margins are already thin.
Yeah.
Right. For a business owner. And the road to success is already so difficult. So to your point, and if we can do things to make life easier on innovators, business owners, people who want to drive the economy, to me, that is the right choice. It's just obviously a challenge between the left and right to get to a place where we can allow that. You know what I mean?
Yep, exactly.
Okay. All right, Rod. So I think we've covered most of the main points that we want to touch on. Is there anything else that you want to touch on? Any final thoughts before we wrap up today's show?
Just that it feels so much like something we need to rein in. right? Even if you level it off, right?
Yeah, at least you're not
slow it down,
like,
or you get to a place where you feel like, okay, at least we have some semblance of control. Right now, there's no even pretending that there's any control.
Yeah, and I would say it this way, Rod. Like in my mind, like let's at least have a plan to do it. Now, I know they say, oh, like every president that's, when they're running for office, everybody's saying, oh, this is my plan. But like, it's always like very loose, and you can poke holes in 100 spots in it. And it's really more as like used to run on than it is like real. You know what I mean? Yeah. And so like the starting point in actually creating, like making a cut into the deficit is having a legitimate plan. And again, I'm going all in on the Richard Duncan side of things, man. Let's innovate, build, and create. But it's so hard to get everybody on board with the right way to go about it. And so we just end up kind of floating in no man's land. But I believe, Rod, I'm a believer in the United States as a country. And I genuinely believe that there will be solutions that come. I don't know where they're coming from, but this is my attempt at putting a positive spin on the end of this show, Rod.
Yeah.
I believe we can get rid of this deficit. I have no idea how, but I think we can do it.
I think just in response to that, I think there are enough people who care enough about it, about the country, right? People who are very patriotic and have thrived because of the environment that the U.S. offers and wants that for their future generations. And so I think people are stepping up.
Okay, let's step up. Okay, thanks everybody for listening this week. Make sure you tune in next week, and we appreciate all of your support. Last little plug, if you've been listening to the show and you haven't left us a review, take 30 seconds and go leave us a review on Apple. That's kind of our preferred place. Okay, thanks everybody for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Money Insights podcast. To learn more about the financial and business strategies discussed in this show, please visit moneyinsights.net. The views and opinions expressed on the Money Insights podcast are not intended to be individual financial, tax, or legal advice. Always consult with the appropriate advisor before making financial decisions. And if you're enjoying the show, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. This will help others find the show and learn wealth-building strategies for themselves. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode.